You can also have family sponsorship, there is business sponsorship, and there is government sponsorship. So the government sponsorship is extremely important because when you commit to going to another state, which we'll cover in a moment, the government sponsorship actually means you only need to score 90 points, but the government will kick in 10 and get you to the 100. So this opens up a lot of occupational opportunities for people who have diplomas or advanced diplomas. So very, very important. And if a state offers you sponsorship, not only does it decrease the points that you require, it also allows you to receive top priority in processing your application. So if it's offered, I'd say you should grab it. English, I mentioned at IELTS level 6. I'm sure all of you understand the IELTS or the TOEFL process. IELTS is what the government requires at the moment, and that is only going to get worse as time goes on, because as we'll see later, level 7 is going to be the benchmark. So there is a process for our skill assessment. This is a critical part of the application process. Whether you are being sponsored by your family, whether it's by the state, by an employer, or whether you are just going to Australia as an independent migrant with no sponsorship whatsoever, you must have a skill assessment. This means that a government-appointed skill assessor will look at your qualification, generally look at your paper qualification, and they will compare it directly to an Australian qualification. If there is a correlation between the two, you will usually have a successful skill assessment. That's strike number 1, new beauty. The skill assessment is only assessed by an authorised assessor. So the government has an act of parliament and it says, we will authorise this and this to assess your qualification. So for those of you who are accountants, for instance, you can use CPA Australia, Institute of Chartered Accountants Australia, or the National Institute of Accountants of Australia. There will be other ones for the doctors, for the chiropodists, for the chiropractors, for the engineers, for the sales and marketing people. They all have their own independent assessors. So, for professionals, you've got to have a degree that's an Australian equivalent. So how do we find this out? Well, we actually subscribe to a series of law books, which is part of the ever-increasing cost of running a migration practice. These books are called the Country Education Profile. So it's not something that you guys are going to be able to access because they're done on subscription only. So the Country Education Profile lists every qualification in the world, when every country in the world, against an Australian qualification. There's a specific book for each country. And generally speaking, level 1 and level 2 universities from Sri Lanka are fine. So, let me see if I can increase the size of that. Can any of you see that? I've got to get the size of it a bit, it doesn't matter. So for those of you who can't see that, but we have lists of all the institutions in Sri Lanka, and as you can see, there is several colleges there. I'm not going to go through A to Z, but I'll bring it up in a second. It talks about the actual level of skill or the level for that particular university or college, some assessment guidelines that we use, and it tells us then that that college is going to be okay. Technical and vocational, therefore tradespeople and diplomas. Others will be things like higher education, where you might find your higher education place ranked at level 1, level 2 or level 3. I'm not so sure it's so much relevant to Sri Lanka, but I can tell you that in the Philippines, many people come out with a degree of 5 years and it's worth a diploma, and they're very, very disappointed when I have to tell them that it's not going to work for them. Because at diploma level you can't succeed. So there's a couple of others. I mentioned University of Colombo there. That is level 1 university. University of Jaffna, they're all level 1 universities. So for people who have qualifications from those universities, they're going to be level 1 and they're going to be a direct equivalent to an Australian degree, usually. I say usually because I like to be have an excuse for making a mistake. It doesn't make sense. So when we also look at how to do your skill assessment, it's very, very important that you're able to get access to the transcript. So the transcript is what we would call sometimes a statement of academic record. You'll have all of the subjects you completed, and hopefully you'll have A. Mine was maybe B or C plus or something like that. Hopefully yours will be all A's and B's. And if possible, to get a copy of the syllabus. That may not be possible to get a copy of the syllabus. It's very rare for someone who has a professional qualification to have to undergo a test. If you're an accountant, an engineer, engineers maybe have to do, there's a specific process for engineers, so let's leave that one out of it. But generally what happens is that the assessor gets your qualification and then does a check off between them. So there's no requirement to sit an exam. Assessment fees can vary. They're going from $350 to $900. Each assessor will charge a different fee. Sometimes people come to us and ask us, how much is it going to cost? And before we've even worked out what their occupation is, it's very, very difficult to give you a total costing. Because if I tell you, if I factor in $300 for a skill assessor, it turns out to be $900. People will be very, very unhappy with me and hit me over the head. So it's very important that we identify your occupation and who the skill assessor will be before we can actually tell you how much your costs are going to be. And remember, the skill assessment fee is paid to the skill assessor. They levy the fee. It's not our fee. Once you get your skill assessment back, you can lodge an application. Now, it might be that we're applying for state sponsorship because the state does give us some very, very important concessions. It decreases the points. It can decrease the English level, although at the moment the states are increasing the level. It can bring in occupations which are not on the federal government's list. It can bring all of these occupations in and allow us to migrate. If the skill assessment is rejected, there is an appeal process, but you really need to have a good reason why that was rejected. Now, the Department of Immigration does need your skill assessment. They also need an up-to-date CV. Work references are also needed, but I don't want a reference that says, John is a good bloke. Because John's not going to put a references that says he's an idiot. We need a reference that says what you do. Because the Immigration Department wants to see that you have work experience in your occupation over a period of time. If you can't verify that you've been working in your occupation, it's possible to get a positive skill assessment and lodge your application, but have it rejected because you don't have work experience in your nominated occupation. So you would go through the whole process, pay all the money, and come up with a reject, primarily because you didn't provide the proper references on company letterhead with the telephone number and someone's name. Now that does bring in some inherent problems. That is, if you go to your manager and say, please give me a reference so I can leave the company, he's likely to say, go now. So we don't really want to antagonise anyone who might have power over whether we work for them. So it's a very, very tender issue. And sometimes we can get letters from senior people within an organisation. We might have things like an appointment letter, a job description. There may be things like pay slips that indicate what you are. Some of your colleagues may be able to write letters supporting your application. And we can then try and negotiate with the Immigration Department over whether you actually need to